Welcome to our talk on translanguaging in identity text for intergenerational transmission of Arabic, Bengali, and Spanish, and we're giving you Canadian perspectives. I'm Dr. Shelley Taylor, and I'm joined by three doctoral students, Sohel Chowdhury, and Lina Dalal-Bachi, and Jennifer Kozak. So to give you an overview of the talk, I'll be giving you some background information on three specific notions: intergenerational language transmission, identity texts, and translanguaging. And I'll also present the research context of the first part of the study and the study that we are about to start working on. So the first part dealt with Indigenous languages and the community context. This study deals with three minority languages: Arabic, Bengali, and Spanish. And we're looking at programs serving those communities and also the K-12 program. Then we'll be looking at the methodology of the initial study, so its design and findings. And we'll also be outlining the design of the current study and the instrument that we have just developed. And then we'll give some concluding remarks for the work in progress. So beginning with intergenerational language transmission, why is it so important to transmit a minority language from one generation to the next? Grenoble and Whaley have explained it in the sense of it's the memory of what was once a way of living. So if you think of First Nations communities, there are certain words that encapsulate things that aren't done anymore, and if you lose the language, you lose the memory and the history of the way they lived before. And it's cultural knowledge that's encoded in the language. And what is urgent about intergenerational language transmission? Crystal has noted that of the world's 6,000 to 7,000 languages, half are going to die within this century, and in fact, one language dies every 2 weeks. And when a language group starts to notice that there's a problem with the language, it's usually too far gone to revitalize that language, and it may be considered moribund already. And so when there's already been a language shift, say the grandparents spoke the language, but the parents are no longer speaking it in the home, and the children are picking up the dominant language rather than the minority language as the home language, their first language, then it's considered moribund. And this is particularly important with regard to the First Nations languages in Canada, because whereas the minority languages that we'll be discussing, if a family stops speaking Spanish or if they stop speaking Bengali or Arabic, there are places that you can go and you can immerse yourself in the community and learn the languages. But this is the home for many First Nations languages, and if it's lost here, it's lost. And so the purpose of language revitalization efforts is to change community attitudes to try and increase the number of first language speakers, or if the new generation, if they are not first language speakers, to design programs where they can learn from the generation that are familiar with the language, and to expand the domains of language use. And how that can be done, you need to find viable procedures, and what we're talking about today is one attempt to find such procedures in the way of translingual dual language identity texts. So to give you a little background on identity texts, they come in many modes. They might be written, spoken, signed, visual, musical, dramatic, combinations of the above. And Cummins and Early describe them as texts that hold up a mirror to students in which their identities are reflected back in a positive light. So rather than coming across reading material that might present one's group in a really pejorative manner, these would, or totally omitting mentioning them, just showing Dick and Jane and having no reflection of Omar and Juanita, etc. So also just not being present in the text, that doesn't hold up a positive light to the students either. So identity texts are a way for students to see themselves in the curriculum and in that way engage themselves more in their learning. And so another purpose is to counter the hegemonic role of English by valorizing minority languages. Denzin and Stevenson McCallan have referred to rewriting societal representations and meta-narratives. and also representing alternative knowledge. And just by the very fact that languages that are sometimes silenced or they're invisible. So that's another way of showing different knowledges also. We're also talking about translanguaging. It's sort of a new term for an old concept and old practices. It's also been referred to in more of the psycholinguistic literature as language mixing, code switching. But Garcia argues that this is, when you speak of translanguaging, you're looking at it from epistemologically different lens, and it's more sociocultural, socio-academic in terms of how people actually use language and why. And so in the school domain, Lewis and Jones and Baker have looked on teachers purposely in bilingual classrooms, for example, changing things around and switching the order of languages and knowing that the students are bilingual or plurilingual and drawing on the teacher's knowledge that you don't have to only use the one language. You don't have to go on for 10 minutes to explain one term if you can just translate and tell them in one word what you're referring to in the textbook, and then they'll have better understanding. Also broadly across a variety of domains, Garcia refers to it as multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual world. So if they're speaking to somebody from a country where they don't have a Tim Hortons, they might slip in the word Tim Hortons. And for New Zealand, that's our local coffee company. So just sort of going from culture to culture, so there's also cultural switching in the way you choose your language. Otaegi, Garcia, and Reed describe it as not just being bound politically that, oh, okay, we're in this context and I know you speak other languages, but we're going to ignore that. We're only speaking the one language because this is the boundary of that language. And it's knowing that people have multiple languages in their repertoire and drawing on them as resources.
Hi, my name is Sohail Chowdhury. As Shelly mentioned, I am a PhD student at Western University. I'll be talking about the Bengali speaking community in Ontario. As Bangla is one of the top 5 speaking language in the world, the Bengali community in Ontario is growing rapidly in the last 10 years. The Bengali communities started coming to Canada even before the independence of Bangladesh as a country in 1971, but the number of the immigrants between 1972 to 1982 is below 100, and with the inauguration of the skilled immigration category and the quota in the point system, the number of immigrants increased 140% in 2001 as opposed to 2,700 in 1996. As most of the parents who migrated to Canada in late 90s and 2000s, the parents had the intention to develop the heritage language, to transmit the heritage language among the children, the next generation. But immigrant children seem to prefer speaking English between and among friends as soon as they develop some proficiency in the new language. And the families, they found that how do they maintain their transmitting their language among the generations. So the families first identified themselves that they discourage their children to speak English in the family with the family members, and they try to set up one home, one parent, and one language policy, so that they don't respond to the children if they speak in English. In a way, if they face difficulty in constructing the sentence structure in their home language, parents help them to develop that. In that way, they help maintain the language. Second way that the parents do maintain their transmitting their language among the children is they expose their children to the media. That means there are a lot of satellite channels available in Canada, which is transmitted in Bangla. So they they rented those satellite televisions, and they expose their children to those channels, so they are exposed to the culture and they know what is the culture, what is the language, and so they become familiar with their home language and the culture. And the third way that they communicate with they communicate their home language to the next generation, to the children, is they have or communication between and within the relatives back home, and their friends, their neighbors who stay here in the same community. So they visit their houses and they talk to the grandparents, grandma, grandpa back home, and sometimes their grandparents visit their home, and also they visit their grandparents in some occasions. But these are some ways they try to transmit the language among the generations. And they also talk about the problems they face while they talk about the way of their transmitting the home language to their generations. The first problem they identified is the lack of available resources or the curriculum in K-12 system. And they talked about that, though they have there's one program, OLA, Home Language Activity Program. They have been familiar with that, has been started in one of the Ontario school boards, but that was not sufficient. That was not reflected the way that the language has been presented among in the original sense. And second problem identified by the families is the lack of funds by the government and the communities. So the community is mostly run by the volunteers, and they don't have sufficient fund to create resources, materials, and then distribute to the community. And third problem they identified is that the resources, the materials available in the community or in the country is not based on translingual realities. As a result, they are looking for more reliable and more real life resources. Now I'll be talking about the OLA program introduced by one of the school boards in Ontario. It is Home Language Activities Program. It is a collaboration program between parents and children and the school. And it is a unique storybook that goes to the children's house, and the parents take the role to communicate with the children about the activities in the book. And it is the purpose of this activity is to encourage parents to use the home language in authentic communication to help develop language concepts related to numbers and numeracy, so that the students can be successful in their school activities. The HOLA program is built on the research conducted by Jim Cummins on the use of first language to be successful in the second language. It is found by the research that if students' background knowledge can be incorporated in the second language learning, the students can be more motivated and can be can learn language faster than in their real situations. The program is organized into thematic units of 6 dual language picture books for young children, and the themes are divided into number concepts, the language of math, and healthy snacks.
Hi there, I'm Jennifer Kozak. As Shelley mentioned, I am one of the PhD students that's participating in this project, and I'll be speaking to you today about the Spanish-speaking community that we'll be including. So Spanish is one of the most widely spoken languages within Canada, and 47% of Spanish-speaking Canadians live within Ontario, and the population is growing rapidly. Canada's total population grew by 12% between 2001 and 2011. However, the Spanish-speaking population grew by 43%. So how is Spanish being maintained in the home? Well, often, Spanish is used predominantly within the home, since grandparents and sometimes even parents have little to no fluency in the dominant language. So the children are using their Spanish to communicate with their families within their homes. Obviously, it's not always the case, but quite often this is what's happening within the home. There's also, as was the case with Bengali, there's also quite a bit of heritage language materials, heritage language media that the families can access. Satellite TV like Tele Latino or music, Hispanic music is very popular at the moment. And there's even quite a few book resources that families can access. So family groups are also quite popular amongst the community groups, and Hispanic language services within the community are quite popular with the Spanish-speaking community. There are quite a few services and programs that are provided by Spanish-speaking community members. So these are all tools that families are using to maintain Spanish at home. But the problem with this is that, as I mentioned, often parents and grandparents are working to acquire English, working to acquire the dominant language. And so their focus is on English and is not on maintaining Spanish in the home. Spanish language and culture is often considered more desirable. These families have often left home for a particular reason and view Canada and view English in particular as more desirable and as a means to better their families' lives and their families' options for the future. So with no fear of losing their native language, the next generation often does lose the language or lose their fluency, but it's not really noticed, it's not really, steps are not taken until it's already too late, unfortunately. So the program that I'm going to be working with is called Mutual Aid Parenting Program. It's called MAP. And it's a program that supports parents in lots of different ways. They support with services, connecting with services in the community, helps with providing a support network for parents. And in particular, there are quite a few Spanish language programs within the larger parenting program. The Spanish language groups tend to have quite a few recent immigrants and refugees to Canada. On average, they have brand new immigrants and refugees, right up to, I think the oldest, the longest amount of time that they'd spent in Canada within the group was about 10 years. So all of these, mostly mothers, it's a parenting group, but mostly it's Hispanic moms who are part of the group. They all have children of all different ages. The majority are newborns to about 16, 18 years. So most of these parents have varying levels of English as a second language, and they're acquiring English, some through high school, some through ESL courses. They all speak Spanish quite fluently and are mostly acquiring English, and hence these Spanish language programs are quite attractive to them. So ideally, what we're hoping this project will be able to, the group that this project will be able to touch will be all three generations, child, mother, and grandparent, whether the grandparent be here in Canada or perhaps is still in the home country. We're hoping that this book project will be able to help all three generations interact, and they'll be interacting in both languages, in both Spanish and English, and they'll be using some translanguaging, as I'll mention a little bit later, with the Spanglish, which is being more widely recognized as an actual trans language.
Hello, my name is Lina Dalal-Bachi. I'm a first-year PhD student in Western Ontario. Today I will speak about the Arabic-speaking Syrian community. So in 2011, the number of the Syrian community was about 41,000. In 41,000 Syrian was in Canada, and this is about 0.1% of the Canadian population. This number raised dramatically in the last year after the Canadian government resettled a lot of Syrian in Canada. So then Canada resettled about 34,000 until now of Syrian refugees in Canada, and so the Syrian community usually in Canada, they settle in two major the biggest provinces, Ontario and Quebec. And most of the communities, the Syrian communities and Arabic in general, are find that maintaining the language and the culture is a challenge for them. So the Syrian used to travel regularly to Syria annually or biannually in order to maintain this connection with the culture and the traditions and also the language. And in addition to that, most of the families develop and adhere to the rule that no English at home. Therefore, they can they help their children to separate between two languages, English outside of the home and Arabic inside the home. In addition to that, they try to maintain a communication throughout the social media with their relatives out in Syria and around the world throughout the social media. But after the crisis of Syria, this situation is totally changed because the Syrian were not be able to travel anymore to Syria, and therefore due to the lack in the Arabic book in the public library here in Canada, so the family find that the access of the reading and written material is quite challengeable for their children. So in order to overcome this obstacle, they start to encourage their register their children actually in the weekend language schools in order to help the children to acquire the language if they are second generation here and if they born here in Canada. So it's very so they can get the standard Arabic. They learn the standard Arabic from these schools. In addition to that, they try to encourage the community to attend the gathering, which usually held on a monthly basis, either in the parks or in the Islamic community centers. In addition to that, the Arabic community in general, and specifically the mosque in most of the Ontario cities, helped the community to maintain the language by delivering the lecture before the prayer in Friday mosque. They try to deliver the lecture before the prayer in Fridays in two languages, in Arabic and English. Therefore, the youth are able to understand and grasp this knowledge of religion, culture, and all the specific material that they need to know. And in addition to that, they can understand it in English, and at the same time, they maintain this relation to the Arabic language.
So this phase one really served as the model for the subsequent studies that we're describing. And this was the Indigenous Language Revitalization Study in the Aboriginal Head Start program. And it was an intergenerational dual language book. What differs between phase one and phase two was it was only a dual language book rather than a translanguaging dual language book, as I'll discuss. So the purpose was, again, to develop materials that would serve practical and symbolic purposes. And because it was in an Aboriginal Head Start program, it had to be age appropriate, and it had to expose the minority language speakers to print in two languages. And when you think of ECE, early childhood education, they were really having their first exposure to print in any language, and so they were exposed to the ancestral language that has a different writing or system, different orthography, and also the English writing system. But the parents were also being exposed to the two different systems. And it was a way of documenting their ancestral language and also their cultural knowledge in print form. And for people who grew up, for example, the parents' generation, never seeing their language in a book, and a book to a lot of people makes something legitimate. If it's in print, it's real. So in that sense, it was an identity text. It was reflecting their culture and their knowledge back to them in a positive sense. And it also reflected their traditional knowledge that was encoded in the language. So for the methodology, phase 1 is really sort of the blueprint for phase 2 involving the minority languages, and phase 1 involved the indigenous language, the very endangered indigenous language. So some of the things that were done in that study are a little bit different than what's being done in the subsequent studies with the other languages. And so it took place as a 2-week-long workshop. The Head Start program, the parents would come twice a week for 2 hours, and so I met with 2 groups of parents twice a week for 2 hours. And so for the workshop, it was really guiding them through how you would design a dual language book, but also what topics they could use, and what was some significant story in their family that they would like to put into a book as a keepsake that they would be able to keep and have the grandparents read in the language with the grandchildren. And so the data collection techniques included participant observation during the time of the workshop and document analysis before, and then interviews with the administrator in charge of the program and the cultural coordinator and the parents who were also authors. And so the procedure for developing the books, we started out brainstorming what sort of stories, legends would be appropriate for 2 to 6-year-olds, and also thinking of a picture book for a young child, very limited print and a lot of pictures, and that was a little challenging in terms of legends. And so actually in the end their books were mainly better for 5 and 6-year-olds than they would have been for 2-year-olds. Some of the topics that they thought of were how the owl ended up being able to eat moose meat and the squirrel could not, so the squirrel was being punished, and how the porcupine got its quills. And so this is some data from after the project where one of the participants, Jenny, was talking about the link between the culture and the family that she was trying to incorporate into her book. But I think before I quote her, I think if you just even notice her name, Jenny, at that point she didn't have her Indigenous name anymore, and so even by that you're seeing the shift to English. So her comment was, I wasn't sure what story to write for the longest time because some of the legends are so long and it's kind of hard to compact it. And when I just went over in my head, oh, how the porcupine got its quills was the only story I figured I could get short pieces and in other words, extract small enough pieces for a book for a small child. It is age appropriate. My daughter likes hearing it. She feels really bad for the porcupine and feels happy when he finally has a way to defend himself. So it's the legend of how he ended up getting quills so he wouldn't be just eaten, that people wouldn't want to eat him because of his quills. It's one of the first legends I remember hearing when I was a child. I'm almost positive it was while my grandmother told it to me while she was skinning animals, lots of memories. And so you see the links between the cultural knowledge, the tradition of skinning animals, which isn't done so much now in the home, oral storytelling, and also the family links, the legend being passed down from the grandmother. And the identity text aspect of it is that it shines ancestral knowledge, the language, the culture, the skills of skinning. People can't skin now, generally, back on the grandparents and parents and children in a positive light. And, but the question is, what sort of advantage would there have been if it wasn't just developed as a dual language text with the one language separate from the other language? And that's what we're looking to explore in the current project.
So as Shelley mentioned, our procedure is going to follow quite closely that of her pilot project. However, in this group, the mothers and children are going to create the intergenerational identity texts together. They're going to work on it during their group meetings. The groups meet once a week for 2 hours, and we'll suggest, we'll brainstorm just as Shelley had done with her group, and some of the ideas that I'm thinking will come up for content, perhaps daily routines, family events. I'm thinking family traditions, and perhaps traditions that people observed in their home countries that they're not observing here, I think will be probably popular topics for their books that they're going to examine. Things like perhaps even food, or how how you prepare potatoes at home compared to how you prepare potatoes here in Canada. And I think the big difference will be then the translanguaging aspect. They'll be allowed to use, or encouraged, I guess I should say, to use Spanish and or English as they like, and in particular Spanglish, which quite a few people use. They just switch back and forth between the languages for whatever concepts are most common in that language. For example, some of the parents have children who have just arrived at, say, 2 or 3 years of age, in like daycare type ages, and they're learning certain concepts for the first time in their second language, in English. So they've spoken as much as they do speak in Spanish for 2, 3, 4 years. But now that they're here in Canada, they're learning certain concepts for the first time. So families can feel free to use the English or Spanish words and translanguage back and forth between the two languages within their books. So ideally, the final product is going to be a handmade multilingual book, including Spanish, English, Spanglish, as the participants choose. And they'll be shared with the grandparents, because there's none of the grandparents included within these parenting programs. So some of the grandparents will be within Canada, perhaps in the home, perhaps nearby, and quite a few grandparents are still in the home country. So the idea is that if perhaps, say, a mother and daughter create a book in the group, that they can go home, and then the daughter could then share it with her grandmother and talk about what she had done and explain how she'd done it. Or perhaps even when the granddaughter and mother or father visit home, they're able to take the book with them. Or in the cases where the families are not able to travel home and they don't financially or politically are unable to visit their family in their home community, perhaps they could be sent home so that the grandparents can feel included in the lives of their grandchildren, where they may have been previously and are no longer able to be. So it kind of bridges the language in all 3 generations, and kind of helps to include families and kind of bring the families together.
So similar to Shelley's project with the indigenous family, we will try to imitate the same program with the Syrian community. We will invite the Syrian mothers for a workshop, and we will help them to pick up the books, the children books that's written in English, and the book that they find mostly appropriate for the traditions and the culture that they want to transfer to their children. The workshop will be held for 2 times, 2 hours in each time, and this can be changed if necessary. If they find that they need more hours for that. During the workshop, the material will be recorded, and the mothers will be asked to modify and read the English books to their children in Arabic, and specifically in Syrian Arabic. in Syrian dialect. The consideration for the modification of the books will be concentrating on the content, so how the content must reflect the family tradition and specifically the routines the mothers want to highlight for their children. And in addition to that, the books will be should be appropriate for children from 2 years old and older, and the recorded material must be appropriate for sharing with the other families in the community and between generations. The grandmothers could participate in this project if they want to transfer this to transfer their knowledge and experiences to their grandchildren. For example, the book that the mother can create during the workshop could be resemble to a book that I recorded for my son during my MA thesis in order to help him develop his language and introduce him to the written material. And so, for example, in this book, and it was a book for children book that's written in English, I used to change the character's name in order to fit more the Syrian or nickname that Syrian use for children, nicknames that Syrian use for their children. And in addition to that, like, I changed also the title of the book in order to fit like the same phrase that I use to indicate the time for sleep. For example, in this one, the book was the title of the book was "Good Night, I Love You." I would translate that into a Syrian dialect. It's not Arabic, it's not standard Arabic, it's Syrian dialect. So I would say, "It's time for bed, honey." And for example, in another example, if we take the last example, bath fun at the end of the day, laugh, splash, giggle, and play, I will not translate that literally, and I will only say it's in the bathroom, and the name of the character, Fufu, and the other one is Susu, and they are splashing each other with the water. So it's kind of these books that will help the children to introduce them to the language, the Syrian language, and at the same time the tradition and culture.
Now we'll be talking about the interview protocol prior to families participating in the translingual dual language identity in this project. The purpose of this interview is to examine the language behavior of the Bangladeshi immigrants in terms of maintaining their home language by transmitting language and language-specific values and expressions among their children. And we will be asked, the participants will be asked how they maintain their home language in Ontario, and to what extent and in what ways is the home language presented and used in the family context. Also, we'll be looking at how they convey community values and attitudes about their home language to their children. Then we'll be looking at the post-project interview questions to see how the resources are useful to the families, to the Bengali-speaking families, to be specific. And if we find that the identity tags that we will create are very much useful for the families, and we can know that information by interviewing them at the post-project stage. And also, if we find some feedback from the families, and if this is they have some concerns or issues that we can incorporate in our research, so that we could modify our research after getting feedback from the families.
Just a couple concluding remarks. In the pilot study, I found that in some sense there was a fair amount of attrition from the project. There were 2 completed books at the end, but there were also some people who participated the whole time but said they were working on their books at home. And the cultural coordinator pointed out at the end that if people were masking illiteracy, if they were functionally literate, that it could be very challenging to not only ask someone to write a book in English, but also write it in a second language. And so the fact that we're taking a multimodal approach with this project, that there's recordings and there's also going to be art, and there are many ways of expressing the text per se. And also with translanguaging this time, which will be much more natural language use. So we are going to compare the results of this project to the initial project and see if this is more feasible, and in hopes of, it's a big need across the various minority language communities, and so what are the implications of this study for going broader with materials development. And so overall, our purpose was to counter the hegemonic role of English by valorizing minority languages. And so, for example, parents and children and grandparents seeing their language in print, which to a lot of people means legitimate, or a recording also, so it's legitimizing minority languages, and rewriting societal representations and meta-narratives where so often the role of English, the dominant language, was being mentioned, and so rewriting the role and the purpose and the value of the languages, and also the fact that they represent alternative knowledge. So thank you very much for attending our talk, and we're looking forward to listening to your talks as well.